Section 4.7 is called CPCTC, which of course is an acronym that means something else. Let's get into what CPCTC stands for. The first C stands for corresponding, P stands for parts, and we're actually going to put the word of in between the P and the C. The second C stands for congruent, the T stands for triangles, we'll put R in between the T and the C, and the last C is congruent. So altogether, CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we'll use this in order to prove that within congruent triangles, the corresponding parts are congruent. So again, in order to use CPCTC, you first must prove the triangles are congruent to then state that another pair of corresponding parts are congruent. So I'd write this down. I would write down what CPCTC stands for, and I would write this next part down as a nice bulleted, highlighted, starred part in your notes, that before you can use CPCTC as part of your proof, you must first show that the triangles are congruent. Because again, within CPCTC, you have to have congruent triangles to begin with. So one more time, before you can use CPCTC as part of your proof, you first must show that the triangles are congruent. We're going to see two proofs where we're going to use CPCTC in order to prove that corresponding parts are congruent. So here's example 1. Segment GK bisects angle FGH and segment GK bisects angle FKH. We are supposed to prove that segment FK is congruent to segment HK. So what we're going to first do, again, we're going to use CPCTC to prove that these two corresponding parts are congruent. So first, I need to prove that these two triangles are congruent. So let's start with our givens. So segment GK bisects angle FGH, which was given. And next we'll do segment GK bisects angle FKH, given. So let's talk about what it means for a segment to bisect an angle, because this is happening twice within our proof. So it says GK, which is right here, bisects FGH. If a segment bisects an angle, it means it cuts it into two congruent angles. So therefore, if GK bisects this angle, that means that this angle right here, FGK, is congruent to this angle right here, HGK. So that's going to be my next step in my proof. So angle FGK is congruent to angle HGK because we knew that this segment bisected that bigger angle. So my reason would be the definition of a bisector. Next, let's look at this given. Segment GK bisects a different angle, angle FKH. So FKH is right here. GK is still bisecting that angle. So that means it's cutting this angle into two congruent angles. So that means that this angle right here, FKG, is congruent to this angle right here, angle HKG. So that'll be my next step in my proof. And just like before, I knew that these two angles were congruent because of the definition of what a bisector is. So remember, eyes on the prize, we want to show that this triangle is congruent to this triangle. So right now I have two angles. I have two angle pairs. So I could either do an angle side or an angle side angle. There is nothing within our givens that will allow me to prove that this side is congruent to this side or this side is congruent to this side. So I'm going to look at this side right here. This segment is shared by the two triangles, and I know a segment is congruent to itself. So I know that KG is congruent to KG because of the reflexive property, which is my next step in my proof. So let's mark that on my diagram. I know that this segment is congruent to itself. So now I see that these two triangles are congruent because of angle, side, angle. So I'm ready to state that triangle KFG is congruent to triangle KHG because of angle, side, angle. So remember, I was asked to prove that segment FK is congruent to segment HK, which is this segment right here and right here. So now that I've shown that these two triangles are congruent, I know that corresponding parts to these two congruent triangles are congruent. So I can now state that FK is congruent to HK because of corresponding parts, just like these two are, of congruent triangles, which we just showed that we have congruent triangles, are congruent. So again, I can state that FK, segment FK, is congruent to segment HK because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So again, in order to use CPCTC within my proof, I have to first state that the triangles are congruent, because remember, this C and this T are congruent triangles. So you have to state that the triangles are congruent before you can use it in your last step of your proof. And our proof's done, so we'll do our 2 tick marks to indicate that. Example number 2, this is our last one. We are given that segment JK is congruent to segment JL, and that M is the midpoint of segment KL. Then we are asked to prove that angle K is congruent to angle L. So everything is marked on the diagram for me. I know that JK is congruent to JL, and that's marked. M is the midpoint of KL, and it's marked for me, but I'm still going to have to state that in my proof. And I'm asked to prove that this angle K is congruent to this angle L. So what we're going to first do is prove that these two triangles are congruent, and then prove using CPCTC that angle K is congruent to angle L. So let's first start with our givens. We'll do those at the same time. So we have segment JK is congruent to segment JL, and that was given, and M is the midpoint of segment KL, and that was given. So because I was told that M is the midpoint of segment KL, I know that KM is congruent to LM because of the definition of a midpoint. And if that wasn't already marked on my diagram, I would mark it with tick marks to show that those two segments are congruent. Within my givens, I was not told anything that will allow me to prove that any of the angles are congruent. But I do see that the two triangles are sharing this common segment. And I know a segment's congruent to itself. So my next step would just be to state that JM is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. And I'm going to mark that on my diagram just so I have the visual of seeing that that segment's equal to itself. So now I see side, side, side. So now I'm ready to prove that this triangle is congruent to this triangle due to side, side, side. So triangle KJM is congruent to triangle LJM because of side, side, side. So now that the triangles are proved congruent, now I can use CPCTC to show that angle K is congruent to angle L. And I would use that reason of CPCTC in order to prove that, because angle K is corresponding to angle L, so corresponding parts of congruent triangles, we showed the triangles were congruent, are congruent. So again, CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And once again, we had to state that the triangles were congruent before we could use CPCTC. Our proof is done, so we'll use our 2 tick marks to indicate that. And actually, this section is done, so make sure you jot down anything you didn't understand so we can go over it as a class before we move on, and we'll see you then.